The gravel ridge road in West Virginia made the headlights feel like they were pushing through a tunnel. The beam hit trunks and brush and just died, swallowed by tight woods on both sides. Loose stone popped under the tires, steady and loud, and every curve felt sharper because there was nothing out there but black. My phone sat dark in the cup holder, no bars, no signal, like it had given up pretending. Hank Whitlow rode in the passenger seat like he was running the whole night without touching the wheel. He kept his window cracked, not for air, for sound. He didn't talk. Every so often he'd tilt his head a fraction, listening into the trees, and I'd find myself easing off the gas before he even said a word. It wasn't friendly silence. It was deliberate, like he didn't want to waste anything he heard. He shifted once and stared ahead, then to the right, then back to the road. He didn't point. He didn't ask. He just spoke, calm and certain. "Kill the lights," he said. I guided the truck into a small pull-off, barely wide enough to turn around in, boxed in by brush and a straight line of tree line a few yards off the gravel. I stopped and cut the headlights. The world collapsed into a dim dash glow and a windshield full of layered darkness. The engine idled, ticking soft. Hank stayed seated. No door, no flashlight, no leaning out. He reached into his coat and pulled out a worn elk call, like it was just another tool. He waited one beat, long enough for the truck to settle into the quiet. Then he made a short call, low and clean. The answer came back in under 3 seconds from the tree line on the right, not down the ridge, not floating in from a distance. Right there, close enough that I could place it between a couple of trunks, like something had been standing just inside the woods waiting to throw the sound back. "That was close," I said. Then the forest shut off, not quiet, off, no insects, no wind, no far-off rustle. The silence was so complete I could hear the idle of the engine and the pulse in my ears, thick and steady. I realized I'd stopped breathing. My chest felt tight, like the air in the cab had turned heavy. Hank's posture changed instantly. Shoulders tight, jaw set. The calm didn't leave his face, but it hardened into something like decision. He didn't look at me. He stared at the tree line like he'd just confirmed a threat. He reached across and caught my sleeve near the elbow, guiding me out of my seat with a grip that wasn't gentle. "Back, now," he said flatly. I moved. My boots hit gravel, and it sounded too loud in the dead silence. Hank kept me close to the truck, angled away from the trees like open space was a mistake. I didn't see anything, but the hair on my arm stood up anyway, like my body had noticed something my eyes couldn't. Hank didn't explain. He didn't swear. He just pushed the pace with his hand on my arm until we were back at the doors. We got in fast. Hank shut his door with a controlled, hard motion and kept his eyes forward. "Drive," he told me. I pulled out of the pull-off and back onto the ridge road, tires crunching over gravel. The darkness behind us didn't look any different, but it felt like we'd left something awake in the trees, something that had answered too fast because it was already there. I kept the headlights low and my hands tight on the wheel. Hank didn't say another word. He just listened through that cracked window while the road bent and climbed, and I drove like the truck was the only thing between us in that silence. Before that pull-off, before Hank's voice went flat, it was just another job, the kind I took all the time. Most weeks my truck felt like an extension of my body. I drove more than I sat still. Deliveries, rides, hauling, odd jobs on mountain roads, whatever people needed and didn't want to do themselves. Around Appalachia, that kind of work never really runs out. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid, and I knew those back roads better than most folks who only talked about them. The roads taught you fast. Where gravel turned to washboard, where fog settled in the hollows, where a blind curve could bite you if you came in hot. I kept the basics in the truck because you had to. A tow strap, a jack, a flashlight that worked, water, and a first aid kit I hoped I'd never open. What always made me laugh was how little I actually got to enjoy the mountains. I liked the idea of camping. I liked hunting culture. I liked hearing guys talk about season like it was a holiday. But I wasn't skilled, and I was always working. Most nights, outdoors meant standing by my tailgate while somebody signed for something and I tried not to freeze. So when Tessa Boone called, it didn't feel like some big decision. It felt like an easy yes, cash in hand, and a chance to ride along with a real hunter for once. "You still taking runs up the mountain?" she asked. I was parked outside a small hardware place, waiting on a guy who was always 10 minutes late and never acted like it. The engine was off, window down, air smelling like cold metal and pine somewhere in the distance. "Yeah. What is it?" I asked. "Easy cash. You just drive," she told me. Tessa wasn't a close friend. She was a name that showed up with work. We'd met through somebody else, the way most people did around here. And after that, she'd call when she needed someone who could get up a rough road without tearing a transmission out. Sometimes it was a delivery. Sometimes it was a ride. Sometimes it was nothing more than, "Can you be there at 6?" She wasn't pushy and she wasn't warm. She was practical. That was the whole relationship. The way she said easy cash, I pictured an older guy who didn't want to drive at night, wanted to get dropped at a cabin, maybe needed a cooler hauled, maybe needed a ride to a buddy's place. I almost said yes without asking anything else. Then I caught myself, because easy cash usually meant some kind of headache hiding behind the word easy. "Hunting?" I asked. There was a pause, short, like she was deciding how much detail mattered. She didn't say anything else. She didn't pitch it. She didn't try to sell me on it, and that somehow made it feel more real. Just drive, cash, hunting. That was enough to hit the part of me that wanted a night out in the woods that wasn't attached to somebody else's problem. I told her I could do it. She gave me a time and a place, a gas station off a main road where the lights were bright and the coffee always tasted like it had been sitting too long. She said the guy's name was Hank Whitlow and to be on time. That was her version of a warning. I showed up a few minutes early, mostly out of habit. The lot was half full, people coming and going, headlights swinging, the smell of diesel hanging in the cold air. I parked where I could see the pumps in the road. I didn't want to look nervous, but I didn't want to be caught off guard either. In my line of work, you learn to read people fast. You also learned that the ones who didn't say much were the ones you paid attention to. Hank didn't show up with any kind of show. No big truck rumbling in, no loud music, no group of guys laughing. He walked out from the side of the building like he'd been there the whole time, hands in his coat pockets, cap low, shoulders squared. He moved like someone who'd spent a lot of years doing one thing and didn't see any reason to move differently now. He stopped by my driver's window and looked at me like he was checking whether the face matched whatever name he'd been given. "You Austin?" he asked. "Yeah," I said, and I kept my tone normal. I didn't act like I was trying to impress him. It never worked anyway. His eyes flicked over my truck, the tires, the bed, the way the front end sat. He looked at my hands on the wheel like he could tell something from them. Then he asked me 2 or 3 blunt questions about where I'd driven, what kind of roads I was comfortable with, whether I had a full tank, whether I was the kind of driver who panicked when gravel turned to mud. He didn't ask them like a conversation. He asked like a checklist. I answered the same way. He nodded once, like he'd gotten what he needed. He didn't smile. He didn't introduce himself in a warm way. He just opened the passenger door and got in like it was already decided. "You drive. You listen," he said flatly. It wasn't rude. It was just a boundary. I felt it settle in the cab like a weight. I wasn't there to hang out with an old hunter and swap stories. I was there to do a job. That should have been obvious, but part of me had still been hoping for something like a lesson, some kind of moment where I got to feel like I belonged in that world I kept watching from the outside. Hank didn't ask me if I'd hunted before. He didn't ask if I was excited. He didn't care what I thought hunting was supposed to look like. He told me what to do and I did it. I pulled out of the lot, rolled onto the road, and headed toward the dark. The further we went, the fewer lights we passed. The houses spaced out, then disappeared. The road narrowed and started to climb, the turns tightening, the pavement giving way to rougher stretches that my tires recognized before my eyes did. My phone lost the last little flicker of service without ceremony. The night out there wasn't empty, exactly. It was full of woods, full of ridges, full of places where your headlights only showed you what was directly in front of you and everything else stayed hidden. Hank sat with his window cracked like he was sampling the air. He kept his eyes forward most of the time, but not in a normal way. He wasn't watching for deer. He wasn't scanning for movement like a guy eager to spot game. He watched the line of trees the way you watch water when you're trying to tell how deep it is. Sometimes he'd glance toward a hollow and hold his gaze there a second longer than made sense. Sometimes he'd tilt his head like he was comparing sounds I couldn't hear. And I realized, without him ever saying it, that he wasn't hunting the way I'd imagined. He wasn't chasing an animal. He was measuring the woods themselves, like the woods were the thing that could answer back. The first stretch after we left the last cluster of lights felt normal enough that I started to relax. The road narrowed, the shoulders disappeared, and the pavement gave way to gravel that crunched steady under the tires. Hank stayed quiet in the passenger seat with his window cracked. I kept both hands on the wheel and did what I always did on mountain roads, slow on the bends, easy on the gas, eyes scanning for deer shine. After a while, Hank lifted his hand, not pointing so much as guiding, and told me where to pull off. It wasn't a real turnout, more like a widened patch where logging trucks had chewed up the edge and left room for one vehicle if you didn't mind scraping brush. I eased the truck in, put it in park, and waited for him to say the next thing. He didn't rush. He didn't get out and stomp around like a guy trying to make noise on purpose. He stayed where he was, passenger side dominant, controlling the pace of it. He reached into his coat and brought out that same worn elk call. I watched his hands while he handled it, the way you watch somebody who actually knows what they're doing. My own experience with calls was basically nothing. I'd seen people use them. I'd heard them on videos. That wasn't the same as feeling the night around you while you waited for something to answer. Hank leaned slightly toward the open crack of window, like he wanted the sound to leave the cab clean and not bounce off glass. Then he made the call. The note rolled out soft and low, and for a few seconds there was nothing but the engine ticking down and the faint creak of the truck settling. I didn't even realize I was holding my breath until I felt the pressure in my chest. Then, from far off, somewhere down the ridgeline where the road fell away into a hollow, an answer came back. It wasn't fast. It had distance. It had space. It sounded like something living, like it had lungs behind it. The timing wasn't perfect. It didn't feel rehearsed. It felt like a bull elk doing what bull elk did, letting another bull know he was there. My whole body did that stupid little rush it always does when something works the way you hope it will. I'd spent years wanting a clean moment like that, wanting to be out here for something other than work. "That's a bull," I said. Hank didn't smile. He didn't even nod. He just listened. He held still for longer than I expected. Most guys I'd seen on videos got excited and moved, like the answer was a green light. Hank treated it like a piece of information and nothing more. His eyes stayed forward, not hunting for a shape, not looking into the trees. He was listening to the way the answer sat in the night, how far it was, what direction it came from, whether there was anything else around it. I waited for him to tell me to kill the engine or to grab a light or to do anything that felt like the next step. Instead, after another beat, he put the call away and shifted his weight like the stop was over. "Keep driving," he said flatly. For a second, I thought I'd misheard him. The answer had been real. It had been exactly what you'd want. I looked at him, trying to read his face in the dash glow, and it gave me nothing. "Why?" I asked. He didn't explain. He didn't argue with me. He just repeated himself like I hadn't spoken. "Keep driving," he repeated. I started the truck moving because at the end of the day he was paying and I was driving. Still, it bothered me. It didn't make sense. You didn't come out this far, on roads this rough, in a night this cold, just to ignore a clean response. It felt like passing up a winning lottery ticket because you didn't like the font it was printed in. We rolled on deeper. The gravel got rougher. The turns tightened. The forest felt thicker in the headlights, like the beam couldn't reach past the first row of trunks. Hank kept his window cracked and his posture steady. He didn't act disappointed. He didn't act like we'd missed out. He acted like that was exactly what he'd expected. That made me more uneasy than the answer itself. After another stretch of driving, Hank did it again. Same hand lift, same calm control of the pace, telling me where to pull off. This spot was even worse than the first, a narrow strip of churned gravel with a shallow ditch on one side and brush on the other. I got us in without scraping the truck and killed the engine. The moment the engine died, the quiet pressed in harder, like the sound had been keeping the woods at a distance. Hank took his time. He didn't step out. He didn't reach for a rifle. He didn't do any of the things I'd pictured in my head when Tessa said the word hunting. He just brought the elk call up again and made the same kind of note, controlled and measured. The answer came back again, and this time it sounded closer. Still not rushed. Still not wrong. It rolled out of the dark with that same breathing space between notes, like the animal was steady and sure of itself. It hit me right in the chest, that same thrill, sharper now because it felt like the night was lining up for us. I looked at Hank like, okay, now you have to admit it. Now we go. He listened. Longer than me, longer than made sense. He wasn't just hearing the elk. He was hearing what else was in the silence around it. He was hearing what I didn't have the ears for yet. I could feel myself getting impatient, which made me feel stupid. Hank wasn't some guy trying to impress me. He wasn't doing this for a story. He was doing it like it mattered. When he finally moved, it wasn't to open his door. It was to put the call away. We could have had him, I said. Hank didn't look at me. He stared through the windshield at nothing I could see, and his voice stayed flat, like he was correcting a kid who'd stepped too close to a hot stove. Not every answer is for you, he told me. I started driving again, but the excitement had shifted into something else. It wasn't disappointment exactly. It was confusion with an edge to it. Hank wasn't here to take the first bull that talked back. He wasn't even acting like he cared if a bull talked back at all. He was collecting answers like they were data points, filing them away, comparing them, and sitting there behind the wheel, following his directions deeper into the dark. I started to realize I'd agreed to a night I didn't fully understand. After the second stop, the thrill was gone. It wasn't that I wasn't impressed. I was. Hearing a real bull answer out in the dark was the kind of thing I'd wanted for a long time. But the way Hank treated it, the way he dismissed it without even moving toward the trees, made the whole night feel sideways, like we were doing everything backward on purpose. The next stretch of road climbed and twisted along the ridge. The gravel got rough in patches where runoff had carved ruts. My headlights picked out the same repeating shapes, trunks, brush, a slick shine on wet leaves. The cab stayed quiet except for the tires and the engine. Hank sat with that cracked window like it was the only thing he trusted. He kept listening, even while we were moving, like he could hear patterns in the woods that didn't care about our speed. I tried to let it go. I tried to tell myself it wasn't my place to question a man who'd probably forgotten more about hunting than I'd ever learn. But the longer we drove, the more it bugged me. And it wasn't just curiosity. It was the simple math of it. We'd already had 2 real answers. Any other hunter I knew, even the weekend guys, would have been out of the truck and heading in. Hank had me driving deeper. I didn't know what he was listening for. I only knew he kept finding something because every time we stopped, he'd sit there a little longer, like he was waiting for the night to do something specific. And every time it didn't, he'd tell me to move on. It made me feel like a tool, like a set of hands on a steering wheel, and I didn't love that feeling. So when he lifted his hand again and told me to pull off, I did it, but this time I didn't swallow my questions. This spot wasn't a pull-off like the others. It was a safer stretch, straight enough that you could see both ways down the road, with a wider shoulder and less brush pressing right up against the doors. If somebody came through, we'd have room to move. If a tire went down, I could work on it without standing in the ditch. It felt chosen for a different reason than the last two stops. I brought the truck to a stop and left the engine idling. The dash glow lit Hank's face just enough to show the set of his jaw. He didn't reach for the call this time. He looked out through the windshield and then down at his hands, like he was deciding whether I had earned an answer. I didn't push hard. I didn't raise my voice. I just kept it plain, like I was asking about the route on a delivery. He didn't react like I'd offended him. He reacted like he'd expected the question eventually, like this part of the night was always coming. "You want to keep going?" he asked. "Yeah," I said. I meant it, even with the weirdness, even with the way he'd shut down both chances. I wanted the experience. I wanted to see what he saw, even if I didn't understand it yet. And part of me, the stubborn part, didn't want to turn around just because I felt out of my depth. Hank nodded once, slow. 5 rules, he told me. He said it like it was a fact, not a warning, like he was telling me the speed limit on a bad stretch of road. I waited, and he didn't rush to explain. That was his whole thing. He didn't fill silence. He used it. The engine kept idling. The woods stayed dark. I could feel the cold coming through the glass and the seams of the cab. I forced myself not to joke, not to make it lighter. This wasn't the kind of man who liked that, and I didn't like the way the night felt when I tried to treat it like nothing. "And if I mess up?" I asked. Hank's eyes stayed forward. "Then I can't bring you back," he said flatly. The words hit wrong. Not dramatic, not spooky, just wrong, like he'd said them before and meant every part of them. He finally turned his head toward me, just enough that I could see his eyes clear. "I'm not joking," he added. I swallowed and nodded like I understood, even though I didn't. Not fully. I knew what it sounded like, and I didn't want to admit that out loud. So I took it the only way I could take it in that moment, as a set of hard rules from a man who'd been in enough bad situations to stop wasting words. I kept my hands on the wheel and listened. Rule 1 was simple, and it came with a hard timer in it. If it answers in under 3 seconds, it isn't an elk. Don't call again. Get back to the truck. Rule 2 was about the light. Keep the flashlight pointed at the ground. Don't sweep the tree line. Rule 3 was about the silence, the kind that doesn't feel natural when it drops. When the forest goes dead silent, don't whisper. If you speak, say one normal sentence, then stop. Rule 4 was the line you didn't cross. Don't step past the tree line. If you do, back out on your own footprints. Don't run. Rule 5 was for the moment you thought you were safe. Once the truck is moving, don't look in the mirror for 60 seconds. He didn't dress them up. He didn't tell a story about a cousin who went missing or a buddy who never came home. He didn't even say the word creature or spirit or anything like that. He just gave me rules, like you'd give a kid rules about fire, because you don't need to understand fire to get burned. I nodded again. I said yes without making it a speech. I told myself he was extreme cautious, old school, maybe a little paranoid from spending too many nights out alone. I told myself he'd seen enough accidents, enough bad calls, enough dumb mistakes, that he treated the woods like a place that punished people for getting comfortable. That was the story I kept in my head so I could keep going. Hank watched me for another beat, like he was checking for sarcasm, checking for the part of me that wanted to test him. When he didn't see it, he shifted back in his seat and turned his attention to the road ahead, the way a man does when the rules are set. And now the work starts. I eased the truck forward again, back onto the gravel, and kept driving into the dark with those 5 rules sitting between us like a third person in the cab. After Hank laid down the rules, the road felt different under my tires. Every shadow had a line you weren't supposed to cross. Every quiet stretch of woods had a question behind it. I kept thinking about that 3-second thing, like it was a joke I didn't get, and I didn't like that I couldn't shake it. I didn't like that he'd said it with the same tone someone would use for a seatbelt. Hank stayed in the passenger seat with the window cracked, the cold slipping in around his shoulder. He didn't tell me stories. He didn't try to scare me. He didn't even talk much at all. He just watched the road ahead and listened sideways into the woods, like he was waiting for a certain kind of silence or a certain kind of sound to show itself. I kept driving the way I always did, but I started paying attention to smaller things. The way the tree line pressed closer in some spots, the way a hollow could swallow our engine noise and throw it back at us a second later. The way the wind would come and go in waves, like something breathing in a slow rhythm. It wasn't that I believed in anything supernatural. It was that Hank Whitlow had been out here more nights than I had been alive, and he'd just told me he couldn't bring me back if I messed up. People didn't say things like that unless they meant them. We went another few miles before he had me pull over again. Another pull-off, a little wider than the first ones, but still tight. I kept the truck angled so we could leave fast if we needed to. I left the engine idling, mostly because it felt safer to have it ready. Hank didn't comment. He didn't ask me to kill it. He just sat there, listening through that cracked window like the glass was a filter he trusted. He brought the elk call up and waited a beat. Not long. Just enough to let the cab settle and to let the road stop sounding like it was still moving. Then he called, low and controlled, like he was placing a coin on a table. The answer came back from a distance. Normal timing, normal spacing. It wasn't instant. It didn't sound too close. It rolled out of the dark like it belonged there. A real bull, somewhere out past the first rise, letting us know he was still in the game. Hearing it like that, clean and steady, made my shoulders unclench without me meaning to. It felt like proof that this could still be what I thought it was. Hank didn't react. He just listened, the same way he always did, like he was weighing the answer, not chasing it. Then a second sound followed it. It was close enough that my skin tightened. It wasn't the same as the bull's answer. It was shaped like it, sure, but it was too clean, too neat. Like someone had learned the notes but not the animal behind them. The timing didn't sit right, and the distance didn't sit right. It didn't travel through the woods the way the first one did. It didn't roll. It snapped into the night and hung there for a second, like it was waiting for us to react. It was the first time all night I felt something in my gut that wasn't excitement or confusion. It was that instinct you get when you realize you're not alone, and whoever's out there doesn't want the same things you want. My hand tightened on the steering wheel. I didn't even realize I'd done it until my fingers started to ache. "Did you hear that?" I asked. Hank went still in a way that made my stomach drop. It wasn't a flinch. It wasn't surprise. It was like his whole body decided to stop giving away anything. His breathing changed, slower and shallower, like he was trying not to add sound to the moment. His eyes stayed forward, not scanning the trees, not searching for movement. He was listening hard, but he was also clamping down, controlling the space in the cab like it mattered. "Yeah," he said quietly. I waited a beat, hoping he'd follow it with something that made sense. A shrug. A normal explanation. Anything. But he didn't give me that. The woods stayed the woods. The road stayed empty. The second sound didn't repeat, and that somehow made it worse, like it didn't need to. "What was it?" I asked. Hank didn't answer the question. He made a decision. "Drive," he said flatly. It wasn't a suggestion. It wasn't a calm, "let's move." It was a command, and it had weight behind it, the kind of weight that told me not to argue, not to negotiate, not to ask for one more second. I put the truck in gear and rolled out of the pull-off, tires crunching as we got back onto the road. I kept my eyes forward, but I could feel the tree line on my right, like it was closer than it had been a moment ago. The headlights swept across trunks and brush and shadows that looked like shapes for half a second before turning back into nothing. I wanted to turn my head. I wanted to look. I didn't. I kept hearing Hank's rules in the back of my mind, like they dug into my skull. As we drove, Hank shifted his posture again. Not panicked, not frantic, just tighter, like he'd gone from casual listening to active control. He reached down and turned off the cab light I didn't realize had been on. He adjusted his window, cracking it a little less, like he didn't want the night inside the truck too much. He didn't touch my phone or the radio because there wasn't any point. Out here, the only noise we made was the one we chose to make. He also started guiding my behavior without saying much. When I let my flashlight sit in the cup holder with the lens angled up, he tapped it down so it faced the floorboards. When my foot got a little heavier on the gas, he lifted his hand, palm down, a silent slowdown. When I made a half sound, the beginning of a joke I didn't even believe in, he looked at me, and the look shut it off in my throat. It didn't feel like he was being controlling to be a jerk. It felt like he was keeping me from doing something I didn't understand, like he was trying to keep me from giving something in the woods exactly what it wanted. We went on that way for miles, the road bending along the ridge and dropping into dips where fog gathered low like smoke. I kept the flashlight pointed down whenever I touched it. I didn't sweep the trees with it. I didn't lean out to look. I didn't talk unless I had to, and even then I kept my voice normal, not low, not secret, not like I was sharing something with the dark. The second sound stayed in my head anyway. Not the bull, the other one. The one that was shaped right but felt wrong. The one that sounded practiced, like it had been waiting for the real thing to speak first so it could lace itself into the conversation without standing out too much. Hank let the silence ride for a long time before he spoke again, and when he did, he didn't soften it for me. "It's listening," he told me. I glanced at him and his face was set, eyes forward like he was watching the road but hearing something just beyond the headlights. "To you," he added. That hit me colder than the night air coming through his window. Not because I understood it, but because I didn't. I hadn't called. I hadn't made any sound out there. I'd been sitting behind the wheel doing what I was told, and yet the way he said it made it feel like I'd already stepped into something just by being present. I swallowed and kept driving, the gravel steady under the tires, the wood steady on both sides, and the feeling in my chest shifting from confusion into something tighter. The night wasn't just a hunt anymore. It was a test I didn't remember agreeing to, and I had no idea what passing looked like. We drove another stretch without stopping, and the longer Hank stayed quiet, the more I could feel him waiting for something. Not a bull elk, not a clean answer, something else. The kind of waiting that isn't hopeful, just focused. The road climbed, leveled, then climbed again. The ridge tightened. I tried to keep my mind on normal things, the way the tires sounded, the feel of the steering wheel, the temperature dropping as we got higher. But that second, wrong sound kept replaying in my head the way it snapped into the night like it had been practiced. Hank's words sat right on top of it. "It's listening to you." I didn't ask him to explain. I didn't want to give him the satisfaction of seeing me rattled, and I didn't want to hear what he might say if I pushed. Instead, I drove and watched the road, and every time I caught myself wanting to lean forward and peer into the trees, I forced my gaze back to the gravel and the yellow lines of my own headlight spill. Hank shifted in his seat and made a small motion with his hand, palm down, slow. Then he pointed, not fully extending his finger, just guiding the direction like he didn't want to make a big deal of it. Ahead, the road widened into a turnaround, the kind built for trucks to swing around without backing into brush. A locked service gate sat off to the side, metal bars chained shut, and beyond it, the woods pressed in hard. The gate looked old. The chain looked newer. It was the sort of place you'd pass in daylight and never remember, but at night it felt like a line drawn across the world. I pulled into the turnaround and angled the truck so the headlights didn't blast straight into the trees. It was instinct more than thought. Hank's rules had already started rewiring my hands. He didn't tell me why this spot. He didn't say this is the one. If he'd picked it on purpose, he didn't show it. He just settled, cracked his window a fraction more, and brought the elk call up again. My throat went dry. I wasn't scared yet in a clean way. I was tense, like right before a near miss on a slick road, when you know something can go wrong and you're waiting to see if it will. Hank called once, short, controlled. The response hit under 3 seconds from the tree line, close enough that it felt like it came from inside the dark itself instead of traveling through it. It wasn't down the ridge, it wasn't across a hollow. It was right there, just inside the trunks, like something had been standing in that exact spot and only needed the signal to answer. Hank's head dipped slightly, like he was marking a time on a clock. 3 seconds, he muttered. My stomach tightened. The words shouldn't have meant anything. They did anyway. I stared through the windshield, trying to pick out a shape, trying to see a body or movement between the trees, and all I got was layers of black and the faint shine of leaves. That's right there, my voice came out tight. Right after the answer, the forest cut out like a switch flipped, not quieter, off. The world went so still it felt fake. No insects, no wind, no distant critters moving through brush. Even the normal little pops and creaks you get when trees settle in the cold were gone. All I could hear was the truck idling and the blood in my ears, loud enough that it made me nauseous. The pressure to speak hit me hard, like my body wanted to whisper, just to prove I could make sound in that silence. I could feel the words trying to form in my mouth, something like, "What the hell?" Something low and private, like I didn't want the woods to hear it. Hank turned his head just enough to catch me before I did it. "Don't whisper," he said flatly. I clamped my jaw shut. My breath sounded too loud in my own head, so I tried to slow it, tried to keep it normal. I kept thinking about Rule 3, the way he'd said it without drama. When the forest goes dead silent, don't whisper. If you speak, say one normal sentence, then stop. It wasn't the kind of thing you made up for fun. I reached for my flashlight without really deciding to. It was sitting in the cup holder, and my hand found it like a habit. I didn't want to flood the trees. I just wanted the comfort of light in my palm, something I controlled. I clicked it on and pointed it down at the gravel by my feet, and for a second that helped. Then my wrist rose. Just a little. Not a full sweep, not a beam thrown into the tree line, but it lifted enough that the edge of the light started to climb from my boots toward the brush outside my door. Hank's hand shot out and pushed my wrist down hard, firm and immediate, like he was correcting a mistake that could get me killed. "Light down," he told me. My pulse jumped. The flashlight beam snapped back to the ground, and I kept it there, pointed at the gravel, pointed at nothing that mattered. My fingers felt clumsy around the handle, like my body didn't belong to me anymore. The response came again. Not from far away, not with that natural spacing. It came like a copy of the first one, but uglier. Less like a bull and more like someone trying to sound like one. The timing was off, the shape was off, and the note didn't roll through the woods the way the real answers had. It sat too close, too clean. Like it was practicing. Then it changed again, and I didn't know how to explain it without sounding crazy. It wasn't words. It wasn't a voice. It was still shaped like an elk call, but it had something in it that felt pointed, directed. Like the sound wasn't just answering Hank's call anymore, like it was trying to get a reaction from the cab. From me. My throat tightened. I fought the urge to whisper again. I kept my breathing normal and my eyes forward, but the skin on my arms prickled like something was watching from just beyond the headlights. "What is that?" I asked. Hank didn't hesitate. He didn't weigh options. The decision was already made. "Back to the truck," he said flatly. We were in the truck. I knew what he meant anyway. Back from the trees, back from the line, back from whatever moment had just started. He leaned slightly toward me, and his voice didn't get louder, but it got sharper. "Now," he repeated. I started to move, to open my door, to do what he said, and for a split second, my mind caught on something stupid. A thought that didn't belong. The idea that if I could just see it, I'd understand. That if I could just aim the light higher for one clean second, I could prove to myself it was an elk and we were overreacting. Hank's hand caught my arm again, the same grip as before, and it snapped that thought in half. "It heard you," he added. That was the moment the night fully turned, not because I understood what he meant, but because I believed he meant it. He wasn't guessing. He wasn't spinning a campfire story. He was responding to something he'd measured, and the way he said it made my stomach sink with a cold certainty. I kept the flashlight down. I kept my mouth shut. I moved the way he moved me, fast and controlled, like the only goal was distance. The dead silence stayed pressed against the cab like a hand, and the trees outside didn't shift or rustle or give me anything to blame my fear on. They just stood there, black and packed tight, while that practiced answer hung in the air like it was waiting for me to do the wrong thing. Hank didn't let me make it complicated. The moment he said back to the truck, he meant away from the tree line, away from the gate, away from whatever had answered too fast. He moved first, not bolting, not scrambling, just stepping out with purpose like he'd done this before and didn't want to teach my body the wrong kind of panic. The dead silence stayed wrapped around everything, thick enough that even my own movement felt wrong, like it should have made noise and didn't. He caught my sleeve again as soon as my boots hit gravel, not to drag me, to steer me, to keep me where he wanted me. "Same footsteps," he told me. I looked down at the ground and hated how useless the beam of my flashlight felt when it was pinned to the gravel. In that little circle of light, I could see my own prints, the edges of them pressed into the loose stone. Beyond that circle was black, and beyond that was the tree line, and beyond that was whatever had answered like it was already waiting. Hank shifted behind me, close enough that I could feel his presence without turning around. His hand stayed on my arm like a tether. It wasn't comforting. It was controlling. And in that moment, I was grateful for it because my instincts were starting to do dumb things. My instincts wanted to move faster. My instincts wanted to run. "Don't run," he repeated. I forced myself to take the same steps back, heel to toe, matching the shallow impressions I'd left. It felt ridiculous for half a second, like a game, like superstition. Then the truck seemed farther away than it had any right to be. The door was right there in my peripheral vision, the shape of it clear, the paint catching a faint wash of light from the dash. And still, it didn't feel close. It felt like the space between me and the truck was stretching in small, quiet increments every time I blinked. The silence didn't break. It didn't even waver. No wind came through the trees, no branch creaked. Nothing in the woods moved in a way that I could point at and say, "That's why I'm scared." It was just absence, the kind that makes your brain start filling in shapes. My breathing started to go shallow. I fought it. Hank had warned me about whispering, about the wrong kind of quiet. I kept my mouth closed and my breath normal, and the effort of doing that made my chest burn. We were almost at the truck when the human cue hit. A metallic click, close and sharp, like a latch being tested. Not the random sound of a branch, not a rock settling. It was too clean for that, too specific. It came from the direction of the tree line, but not deep in it, like it was right at the edge, near enough to be a hand reaching out without crossing a line. My whole body tried to turn toward it. I could feel my head wanting to snap that way. I wanted to look so badly it hurt, like looking would end the feeling of being watched. Hank's grip tightened and held me facing forward. The click came again, followed by something softer, a faint door sound, like someone shutting a vehicle door carefully. It wasn't a slam. It was that controlled close you do when you don't want to draw attention. It was wrong in a way my brain didn't know how to process. The sound didn't belong out there. Not that close. Not in that silence. My pulse jumped so hard, it made my vision blur at the edges. I wanted to say something. I wanted to ask Hank if he heard it, even though I already knew he did. I tasted the first syllable of a whisper and swallowed it back. Hank didn't look. He didn't react the way a normal person would react to a sound like that in the woods. He stayed disciplined, like he was refusing to feed it any response. We reached the truck. Hank moved fast now, not panicked, but urgent in a way that put a hard edge on everything. He opened his door, then pointed at mine like it mattered which side I entered from. "Get in," he said. I got in. The cab felt too small the second I was inside, like the darkness outside pressed right up against the glass. I pulled the door shut, not gently, but controlled, and I locked it without thinking. Hank was already closing his door at the same time, and the timing felt deliberate, like he didn't want the sound of one door followed by the other, like he didn't want to make it a call and response. He didn't start the truck immediately. That was the part that almost broke me. My whole body wanted movement, wanted distance, wanted the comfort of tires on gravel. Hank sat still with his hand on the key and his eyes forward, waiting out a beat like he was refusing to answer whatever that click had been. The silence outside stayed perfect. Too perfect. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat. My palms were damp on the steering wheel. My flashlight was still pointed at the floorboard, useless and obedient. Hank finally nodded, small and sharp. "Go," he told me. I turned the key. The engine caught and the sound felt like punching a hole in the dead air. I put the truck in gear and rolled forward, tires crunching on gravel, and I didn't look toward the tree line. I didn't look anywhere but the road that curved away from the turnaround. I kept the headlights low and the wheel steady and my jaw tight. The first few seconds of movement didn't make me feel safer. They made me feel exposed. Like the moment the truck moved, we'd admitted we were leaving. Like leaving was an answer. My eyes flicked toward the rearview mirror without me deciding to. It was instinct. Check behind you. Confirm you're not being followed. Confirm you're not alone. Hank's voice cut through it like a blade. "Don't look in the mirror," he said flatly. I held my eyes forward, but my neck went hot with the urge to disobey. The mirror was right there. The dark behind us was right there. I could feel it like pressure on the back of my skull. "Why?" I asked. "Because that's you agreeing," he told me. That landed hard, not because it explained anything, but because it put weight on something I'd never thought about. Agreeing. Like this was a deal. Like the woods weren't just a place, but a thing that made rules the way Hank made rules. And if you followed the wrong impulse, you'd be consenting to something you couldn't take back. I kept driving. I stared at the strip of road in the headlights and made myself anchor to it the way Hank wanted. I watched the right edge where gravel met brush. I watched the center of the lane. I counted the turns as they came. One bend left, one bend right, another shallow curve. I looked for anything that felt fixed and real. The dead silence didn't follow us immediately. It clung for a while, and that was the worst part. Even with the engine running, the night stayed unnaturally empty, like the world outside the cab didn't want to make a single sound, until we either did something wrong or got far enough away that it couldn't hold it anymore. Hank kept his gaze forward and his window cracked, still listening, still measuring. Every now and then he'd say one word, like a driver's instruction, not a conversation. Slow. Easy. Keep it straight. He didn't let me fall into panic. He didn't let me speed. He didn't let me do anything that looked like running. Somewhere past the third or fourth bend, it broke. The dead silence cracked open, and normal sound rushed back in like a flood. Wind in the branches. A faint hiss of leaves. The tiny, distant noise of insects that I hadn't realized were missing until they returned. It was so sudden I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because it felt like coming up for air after being underwater too long. My shoulders dropped a fraction. My hands stopped shaking enough that I could feel the steering wheel again. Hank didn't relax. He didn't celebrate. He just stared through the windshield, jaw tight, like he was still counting time in his head. After a long moment, he finally spoke, and his voice stayed flat, almost tired. "It didn't answer my call. It answered you," he said flatly. I swallowed hard and kept driving, because I didn't know what else to do. The road kept unspooling ahead of us through Appalachia like it always had, gravel and trees and darkness, but I knew something I hadn't known before. The woods didn't have to chase you to take something from you. Sometimes it just had to listen long enough to learn the shape of you, then wait for you to come back on your own. By the time we got back toward anything that looked like civilization, the sky had lightened in that flat gray way it does before sunrise. The roads widened, the turns loosened, the trees pulled back a little, enough that I could see more than a tunnel of headlights. Normal sounds stayed normal. Wind moved the way wind moved. A distant dog barked from a house somewhere down a hollow. The world acted like the world again. That didn't fix what I felt. Hank had me drive to a spot he chose. Not a house and not a cabin, just a place that made sense for somebody who didn't want anyone knowing where he lived. A wide shoulder near a closed business, a dark lot with enough room to turn around, lights off, nobody around. He didn't invite me anywhere. He didn't offer coffee. He didn't say good job. He just sat there for a moment with his hands on his knees like he was waiting for his own pulse to settle. Then he reached into his coat and handed me cash. Folded bills counted clean, no argument. He stepped out, shut the door, and walked away from my truck without looking back. He didn't hurry, but he didn't linger either. He moved like a man who'd decided that leaving the situation wasn't enough. He had to leave the conversation too. I sat there with the money in my hand and watched him disappear into the gray morning. I thought about calling out to him, asking him what the hell that was, what he meant by agreeing, what he meant by it, heard you. The words stayed stuck in my throat. I didn't want him to turn around and look at me the way he'd looked at the tree line. I drove home. For the first day, I told myself I'd sleep it off and it would settle into some weird story I'd tell later. The kind you laugh about because laughing is easier than admitting it scared you. The second day, I realized it wasn't settling. I texted Hank once, simple, just asking if he was all right. No response. I called. It rang until it didn't. I waited a few hours and tried again. Nothing. It wasn't like getting ghosted by a friend. It was like Hank had erased himself on purpose. So I called the one person I knew who could reach him if anyone could, the one person who'd set the whole thing up. I didn't want to sound crazy, so I kept it professional, like a job question, like maybe he'd forgotten something in my truck. "Have you heard from Hank?" I asked. "No," she said. Tessa sounded annoyed before she sounded worried, like she assumed I was calling to complain about something normal, like she assumed I was going to ask about money or timing or directions. To her, that night was a booking and nothing else. Hank was a client. I was a driver. She connected the dots and got her cut. That was it. I tried to explain without explaining. I asked if he'd said anything after. I asked if he'd called her. I asked if he'd mentioned doing another run. Her tone stayed flat and practical, and it made me feel worse, because it was proof she didn't know what I knew. I didn't push. I didn't tell her about the dead silence or the 3 seconds or the latch sound in the trees. I just ended the call and sat there staring at my phone like it might suddenly show me a message that fixed everything. It didn't. Days went by. Then more days. I went back to work because I didn't have the kind of life where you could stop working just because you had one bad night. I drove the same roads. I did the same errands. I smiled at the same people. I acted normal because normal was what you did. but I started making choices without thinking about them. I avoided certain routes. I avoided roads that cut too close to heavy tree cover. I didn't take shortcuts through the backwoods anymore. If a job took me up onto a ridge road late, I told the person I'd do it in the morning or not at all. I told myself it was just caution. Then the residue started showing itself in small, impossible ways. The first time I heard it again, I was nowhere near the woods. I was standing in a grocery store parking lot in town with a bag of ice in my hand, and I caught this thin, distant sound on the edge of my hearing. It was so faint I almost blamed it on a car alarm or a bad speaker somewhere. But the shape of it turned my stomach before my brain could label it. An elk call. Not loud, not clear, just the start of one, like a note someone didn't finish. I froze, ice melting through the plastic and stinging my fingers. I listened harder, holding my breath, and the sound stopped. When I let my breath out again, the sound came back, barely there, like it was tied to the space between my breaths instead of the air around me. I went home and told myself I was tired, that my brain was replaying the night. That stress did weird things. I tried to laugh it off in my head and couldn't. It happened again 2 nights later while I was brushing my teeth. Same thing. A faint, unfinished call in the quiet of my bathroom, like it was coming from inside the walls. I spit, stared at my own reflection, and kept the bathroom light on until morning like a child, because the alternative felt worse. After that, I noticed patterns I didn't want to notice. The sound didn't show up every time. It showed up when I was alone, when it was quiet, when my mind started drifting, when I caught myself thinking about that turnaround and the locked gate and the way the forest had shut off like a power switch. And the worst part was how the timing kept matching me. Not matching the clock, not matching traffic noise, matching my breathing, the little pauses, the moment right before you speak, like it was still practicing. A week after the night, Tessa called me back like it was no big deal, like she was returning a missed call. "Clay said he's home," she told me. I didn't answer right away. My hand tightened around the phone so hard my knuckles ached. "He doesn't go out much now," she added. That should have been reassuring. Home, alive. Instead, it made my skin crawl, because it sounded like the only way Hank knew to stay safe was to stop moving through the world. Like he decided the woods didn't have to take you in the moment. It could wait. It could learn you. It could show up wherever you got quiet enough to hear it. I didn't ask Tessa anything else. There wasn't anything she could give me. She didn't know what Hank knew, and she didn't want to know. She was a middleman, a name in your phone, a voice that said, "Easy cash. You just drive." After that, my choices stopped being temporary. I stopped talking about camping like it was something I'd do someday. I stopped watching hunting videos. I stopped buying gear I didn't use. I stopped taking jobs that required me to pull off on a dark mountain road and sit with the trees pressing close. If someone asked me to go up a ridge at night, I told them no. If someone asked why, I shrugged and said I had a policy now. If they laughed, I let them laugh. I didn't explain. I didn't step into the woods anymore. Not for work, not for fun, not for anybody. And the worst part wasn't admitting I was scared. The worst part was realizing it didn't need to follow me out of the forest on feet. It only needed my rhythm.